Right down here.
Is everybody familiar with cherries or not?
Oh yes, yes, I am actually looking.
Margaret.
Yeah, yeah. I've been on too long.
She was like
Becoming like that now. You've seen everything for so long. The Devolution Brexit stuff, 3 years ago now, just after the vote, and said there are consequences, of course, because we've been paralysed. None of those consequences have been taken forward. And the May government made such a hash of it. And it's not that they weren't true. They were told extremely clearly, of course, they did what they were planning to do. They would all go wrong, and they would have to undo it. That's what happened. There was an easy way to do it and a hard way to do it, and they chose one. And got all the political damage. And they got political criticism. Whatever they done, just that they give a real excuse rather than to check one. Check on.
Now on to the next question.
Everybody's not territorial. Having territorial differentiation, not having it is an unusual thing, and we were unusual for a long time. Or in the extent to which we had it with the notice. And the effect is that and also it's highly politicised here. There is no Texas independence movement. There is a states' rights movement. And there's no political movement. Most of it is the result of in Scotland, shouting at the UK government and saying to Labour politicians, this is normal. Other countries have this all the time.
Right, ready? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our newsroom. For those who've not been before, welcome to a ThinkIn. Tonight we're going to have a conversation about what feels like our ever so slightly fragile union. I see some familiar faces this evening, but for those who've not been here before, a ThinkIn isn't another panel debate. It's a forum for civilized debate, for discussion, and we want to hear your views, your experience, your expertise. So there's one rule which is enforced sometimes very strictly, sometimes not at all, depending on the mood of the chair, and that is no questions, please. Except for me, I am allowed to ask questions. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are being filmed. There are cameras, there are microphones, hence the lighting, but please do feel free to be as indiscreet as possible. We want to hear all the juicy gossip that you might have. I'm just going to introduce our star panel. So to my right is Kevin Marr. Kevin is a writer on British and Irish politics and was previously a special advisor to Shaun Woodward as Northern Ireland Secretary. Jess Sargeant is a researcher who specialises in devolution at the Institute for Government. Jim Gallagher is a former senior civil servant and also worked on the Better Together campaign up in Scotland. And finally, Sunder Katwala, who is director of the Identity and Integration think tank British Future. So before I come to our experts, I just wanted to ask a question of the room. One of the sort of criticisms you get of the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party is they're no longer the Conservative and Unionist Party. They would happily chuck off a bit of the Union, Northern Ireland, Scotland, in order to get their precious Brexit. But I wanted to ask the room, no matter what your favoured Brexit end state, whether it's the hardest no deal possible or revoke and pretend the last 3.5 years never happened, whatever you would like to see, in that hypothetical, would you be prepared to sacrifice a bit of the union to get it? So put your hands up if you would be prepared to lop off one of the bits of the union in order to get your desired Brexit end state. Is that yes? So put your hands up. I see 3 and 4. And who would not be prepared to sacrifice the union to get? That's really interesting. So I'd say a big majority, certainly bigger than 52-48 for the union, which is nice to see. So can I get one of the people? So I think you put your hand up saying that you'd be prepared to to ditch a bit of, I don't know, what do you prefer, Northern Ireland or Scotland to get your Brexit end state? Would you mind whenever you speak from the in the room, if you wouldn't mind just saying your name so we know who we're talking to you. So you, sir.
I think I was the other side.
Are you at the other side? Okay, so tell me why. I'm sorry for that slander. Tell me why you would sort of preference our union over the European Union.
I would say I wouldn't. I say I'm more for union of any kind. I definitely feel like we should be a United Kingdom instead of united to Europe.
And could one of the brave minorities in the room, I think I can tell from your rather bashful face that it might be you, sir. Can I get your name?
Martin.
Martin. So Martin, tell me why you put your hand up for the other proposition.
Personally, because I'm in favour of United Ireland. So if getting my preferred outcome for Brexit means I get what I want on a larger scale, I'm fairly happy with that.
Kevin, you put your hand up. So same question to you, really.
I think the UK, first of all, is not a marriage of equals. It's England plus the other bits. And to put it crudely, if you're Scottish and you were a victim of the poll tax, which was implemented in Scotland a year before it was implemented in the rest of the UK, or you live in South Wales, that's seen massive deindustrialisation in the 1980s and 1990s, with all the concomitant problems that still exist. Or indeed, of course, if you're in Northern Ireland, which is obviously a place apart in so many ways, as we may touch on, you would sense, I think, that the UK is not a marriage of equals to begin with, and in a sense, it's that kind of instability has been, I think, tested over the last few years particularly. I think there was an assumption perhaps with the last Labour government that if you bring in devolution to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, that's kind of job done, and that was a rhetorical device in any new Labour minister's speech for a very long time. But I think it disguises some of the underlying tensions that were still there, and I think we've seen in the last few years, those tensions bubble to the surface. I think the issue of Scottish independence, particularly the referendum result in 2014, is something that Westminster and if I can, the London media political class has never really internalised the lessons from that. You know, this is a referendum on leaving the UK at which 45% of Scots, despite David Beckham, Richard Branson, another person saying, please don't go, it'll be a bit of a disaster, despite the fact that the SNP's campaign and the economic prospectus was a bit hooky, to put it mildly. Even with all those kind of headwinds, 45% of Scots decided that they wanted to leave the UK. Now that's massive. That's always been absolutely massive. That's only 5 years ago, and that's not been put to bed clearly. And of course, when you pile Brexit on the top of that, you just reboot the whole argument once again, which is why, you know, I would suspect, you know, Scotland is teed up to leave at some stage anyway. So it's not a marriage of equals. I think that's a fundamental point of the UK to begin with. There's lots of pressures that have been in there. There's lots of pressures that have been managed for a long time. And I think those pressures are becoming so volatile that eventually we will see some really significant changes.
Sunder, you are an expert on identity. I guess my first question for you is, what is keeping us together at this point?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the United Kingdom's changed a lot. British identity has changed a lot. I think we underestimate how different it is now from how it was 40 years ago or 20 years ago. In a way, part of the increasing disunity of the United Kingdom is that the rules are now much clearer, and whether or not how equal or unequal it's been over several centuries, it's much more explicit now in terms of what's keeping us together. It's a union of consent. And so nothing is keeping us together other than there not being a sustained majority in one part to leave. So if there is a majority in the north and south of Ireland to have a united Ireland, it has been British government policy, you know, emerged in the 80s and 90s, that ought to happen, and that Britain, the United Kingdom, has no selfish or strategic interest in stopping it happening. The referendum in Scotland in 2014, you know, was conducted on the premise that the result would happen and that there was an agreed process of a referendum. So the rules of breaking up the United Kingdom are much clearer than the rules of breaking up Spain, for example, where the Spanish Catalonia debate now, you know, in the courts, in the prisons, on the streets, in the ballot boxes, and so on. So the only thing that's keeping us together is potentially fragile majority consent to stay in, and the only barrier to getting out is to actually have a majority of the population that you say wants to leave actually leaving, and that is much clearer, I think, than it would have been. Now, you know, there are always people who will say, you know, Welsh independence is about to rise, and that, you know, that's a conversation just beginning now, and, you know, it's been a strong entrenched devolution. But, you know, starting a conversation about independence, there are people who sort of say, you know, London should go, because we're very upset about Brexit and so on, and that's just daydreaming, really. And it's sort of the opposite of the conversation that London should be having with itself about how it's seen in the rest of the country. But I don't think people think like this very much. In a way, I think this is quite a charge that you just say, Boris Johnson, I thought you cared about that, the union. Where's your unionism now with your Brexit? But the people saying that, I'm not sure, you know, save the union. It's not really a Remainy slogan. There are some strong unionist Remainers, you know, perhaps particularly in Scotland and elsewhere. But I think it's quite an instrumental thing that a lot of liberal Remainers have discovered is, you know, one of the charges they can put on the charge sheet.
I'd like to just go back to the room, and, you know, England is about, the last census was England's about 85% of the population of the UK lives in England. And so of the Londoners and people from England in this room, I guess my question, if anyone wants to speak on what's it to us, and, you know, is it just a case of us saying, please don't leave, we quite like you, or do we not have a place in this debate, and it's for the people of Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement, or the people of Scotland through a possible Indy Ref 2, and they get to make the decision, and we just have to stay quiet? Does anyone who is English or not have a view? Sir, can I get your name?
Breaking up the union is just another byproduct of the shit decision to leave the EU. It's not the other way around. We shouldn't be, if you don't want to leave the EU, I don't mind if Wales or Ireland want to leave the UK, but I don't want to leave the EU. And I think that's the right way the question should be approached. I mean, I don't blame the Scots for wanting to leave, but they may be less likely to leave if we weren't leaving the EU.
And do you think that, in your mind, is Brexit just a catalyst for what we're seeing?
Yes.
So do you think that these issues were underlying before and Brexit has just accelerated them?
They're all sort of colonial type issues, aren't they? I mean, they're never going to go away. So, you know, the irony is that Ireland could become unified over Brexit. I mean, wouldn't that be a hoot?
Anyone else in the room? Before I come to our editor, Kerry Thomas, and resident Welshman, one thing I should have said at the start is you look over there you see our tortoise Agatha, and she has already made great strides from left to right across the screen. So if you do have a burning thought, although not a burning question, please do speak up sooner rather than later, because she always gets there sooner than you think. Kerry.
So you already outed me as well, so thank you for that. So I'm not answering, obviously, your question was to the English people in the room, what would the plea be to the other nations? I think, I agree that there is clearly a change in attitude in Wales now towards the idea of the union. That something has changed in the last couple of years that's quite interesting, low level, by no means pointing to independence yet, but something is moving there, and it's really interesting to see. I think the argument for English people that I would make is that that it's really hard to know what exactly in England would change, but England would be different if England were alone. And that, from my perspective, the Brexit project is essentially an English nationalist project. And if that is the country that you want to live in, then you know what to do. But I know already, even with this, I say, this very latent, low-level change in what I see as the relationship between Wales and England, that I would feel differently about living here were it not part of the United Kingdom. But I think English people too would see that a difference would come. That we are, Wales has become more English over the last, there's a much greater proportion of English people resident in Wales now than there was a generation ago. So there is this intertwining that's important, significant, and would be noticed, I think, in both directions if there was a parting of the ways.
Jess, with your IFG hat on, could you talk a little bit about how our country actually works? So you specialise in devolution, and we're not a federal country, but we have devolved parliaments and assemblies. We have metro mayors in England. We obviously have the mayor of London and London Assembly. But is this sort of mix and match of devolution and devolved powers in different countries, is it working?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it earlier, that there's kind of this kind of patchwork of devolution, which doesn't really have a kind of central overriding principles attached to it. And a lot of the kind of underlying tensions of this kind of mismatched constitution have been brought out by Brexit. So obviously the UK government is pursuing its policy of leaving the EU, despite the fact that it's opposed by the Scottish and Welsh governments. And now Boris Johnson's deal is opposed by all parties in Northern Ireland. But the UK government, because international relations and EU matters are reserved matters, constitutionally, it has the right to do that. But a lot of the other devolved administrations have different constitutional understandings, that even if legally the UK is on safe ground, politically it becomes a big problem. So as we mentioned earlier, Scotland, the claim of right, the kind of idea of self-determination is very strong there. And actually in the withdrawal agreement bill, there was a part of it that reasserted UK parliamentary sovereignty. And actually in the Scottish Government's consent memorandum, that was one of the clauses they objected to, because they said, you assert UK parliamentary sovereignty like it's some kind of undeniable principle, but actually the different constitutional understandings are contested. Similarly in Wales, there's different understandings, although they don't perhaps have that same tradition of self-determination as Scotland. They still believe that the Welsh government in different parts of the UK should have more of a voice in centrally made policies. And similarly in Northern Ireland, there's a whole different understanding based on kind of the two communities and the principle of consent and the right to become united if that's what both parts of Ireland decide. So I think what we're seeing here is these different constitutional understandings that have been brought out so strongly by Brexit. And I think if the UK government doesn't adapt to the kind of new reality in which it finds itself, that's when you're going to see even more strain put on the union.
And what does that adaptation look like? How does it manifest itself? What should we be doing if we want to be more nimble?
I think one of the main things the UK government needs to do is to stop just asserting a sovereignty. They need to agree principles between the four nations of the UK. And there is some work kind of around the edges being done about that. Obviously, intergovernmental relations is a big issue. There's no kind of formal structures in which the devolved nations are consulted in decisions that are reserved. There's kind of these ad hoc forums that are basically called when Westminster wants them. And so there is some work going on there to think a kind of joint approach between the four nations as to how better understand that. But really, I think the whole machinery of government needs to change. A lot of people in Whitehall, when they're making policy decisions that affect people in the devolved nations, don't necessarily feed in or understand those perspectives. So it's really changing about the whole way government functions, to be honest, how civil servants make decisions, how kind of, even the UK Parliament sometimes takes decisions as well. Again, we've seen some minor reforms, but I think there kind of needs to be a whole-scale change of approach.
Jim, did devolution in Scotland make... I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but I watched parts of Nicola Sturgeon's speech yesterday and sort of feel like her entire manifesto can be reduced to independence referendum please. Do you think that devolution made independence... Is it a slippery slope? Is it a gateway drug to the real thing?
I think that it's easier to argue that, and it's very hard to get cause and effect here. If you don't bend, you break. And if over the last 30 years, the United Kingdom had denied all form of self-expression to Scottish or Welsh identity, Northern Ireland's a different story, then I think we would most likely have been independent by another route by now. I think the interesting thing at the moment, and I think the identification of the word nationalism is absolutely spot on. We are in a world at the moment which is increasingly, apparently, dominated by nationalisms. And some of them are the assertions of new nations. A lot of them are the reassertions of the powers of pre-existing nations. So you've got Donald Trump, and you've got Viktor Orban, and you've even to a degree got Macron, and back here you've got the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish and the English suddenly asserting themselves in a nationalist form. Of course, their nationalism's different. Their other is not the rest of the UK, which is peripheral mentally and geographically and economically. Their other is mainland Europe, whereas the other for the Scots is England and so on and so forth. And the fascinating thing is that it is English nationalism which has revived Scottish nationalism. And 2014 was undoubtedly a huge event when the nationalists were immensely successful in Scotland, getting from 30 to 45, to put it crudely. But had nothing else happened, I'm not sure that we would not be seeing what we're seeing at the moment. We would not be seeing 50 in campaigning. And that is because it makes it much easier for nationalists to describe, Scottish nationalists, to describe England as other and different. I think you were wrong about Nicola's manifesto, about her speech. Her manifesto was Boris Johnson, okay? Her manifesto is that England is different from us. And I think that does take you into the devolution question, because if the UK is going to hang together, and Sunder is right, of course, it is a consensual relationship. It is not the Catalonian and Spain story. It has to find a way of recognising that asymmetry, that inequality, if you like, that Kevin mentioned, in a way in which we've not yet succeeded in doing. We haven't yet found the asymmetrical federalism that will work for the UK. Now, my view is that we need to understand first that the three unions in the UK are different. There is not a union. There are three unions. The Welsh Union was conquest 1,000 years ago. Henry VIII overrode the Welsh laws. The Irish Union was conquest and rebellion, and conquest and rebellion and partition. The Scottish Union was a negotiated deal, messy, horrid negotiated deal. And so simply to answer, to ask your question in the form of breaking up the UK, well, it depends which bits you're talking about. And there is certainly a model, potentially for all parts of the current UK, most certainly for all parts of the island of Britain, in which you have a more asymmetrical, decentralised system, which finds a way in which the smaller nations, as you put it, Jess, get recognition and voice at the centre in a way which we haven't managed in the present system. Not least because, of course, if you elect MPs who are never going to form the government, you're not going to get much of a say in the matter. So that's a challenge. The interesting question is whether the present UK administration even understand that there is such a challenge, never mind how we're going to answer it.
Before I come to Sunder with a question about identity, I just wanted to come back to the room and ask if you are English or British, if you are both English and British, I just wanted to get an idea of who feels more one than the other. So if you are from England, could you put your hand up if you feel English? And a couple, and who would say they feel more British? It's another very big majority. I'd like to come to Madam. Can I get your name and pick on you? Gillian. So tell me, how does your Englishness manifest itself over your Britishness?
Well, first of all, can I make a comment about the use of the word nationalism? When did that become such a pejorative word, and why is it always used pejoratively? If we took away the word nationalism and used the word patriotism, we'd suddenly have a very different argument and discussion. That's just one point I want to make. Why do I feel English? I suppose because I come from Anglo-Saxon descent. I studied Anglo-Saxon at university. I'm an English teacher. I read the canon of English literature and teach it. So, yes, I mean, that doesn't mean I'm not happy to be British. It doesn't mean I'm not all the other things, but I feel English. But can I raise another point?
Go for it.
Patriotism or nationalism. We've excluded Cornwall from this, and the rise, I've got a home in Cornwall, the rise in nationalism or patriotism in Cornwall is quite outstanding. Prince Charles, as Duke of Cornwall, has a new town being built on the edge of Newquay called Nansledden, and every single street name, every single building has got a Cornish name. The Cornish language is alive and well in Cornwall, and that is increasing. More people are learning it and so on. So it's happening in Cornwall as well. And whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not able to judge.
And anyone from the other side of the debate, from the majority who feel more British than English? Anyone? Yes, sir.
It's probably a comment that's...
Sorry, can I just get your name?
Pete.
Pete.
It's probably a comment that's more relevant since the Brexit referendum, is that, frankly, a lot of what you associate with Englishness, I'm embarrassed about now, compared to the Britishness. I guess I'm a Remainer. So what I tend to associate now with somebody who would proudly state they were English, no disrespect to the lady from the front, is that nastiness around the, actually, I don't care what goes on in Scotland or particularly in Northern Ireland, because it's about what I want as an English nationalist, and to me that just smacks of everything that I don't want to label myself as.
So you had your hand up.
I'm just going to...
Can I just get your name?
My name is John.
Hi, John.
My point that's been made here before is I think it would help if we had a written constitution.
Did James Harding ask you to say that?
No, he didn't. But I do agree with what he says. If we had a written constitution, we would be able to compare what's being proposed for Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales with what we had written down. We would be able to measure or assess these new ideas in the context of what's already been agreed. So my recommendation would be, let's go ahead and do that as soon as possible, because once the election has been concluded, then these arguments will come to the fore, and we need some sort of defence or some measure of what sort of change is going on.
I see vigorous head nodding and shaking, which is excellent. Exactly what we want to say. To see. If Gillian, you were vigorously shaking your head, do you want to?
I think the English legal system and the laws of our land are copied and famous all over the world. Our case law system is second to none. If we have a written constitution, we're bound by a constitution, but lose immediately the flexibility of the case law system. I mean, to be horrendous.
Sunder, we had a chat earlier in the week, and you said something that I thought was absolutely fascinating, which was the difference between someone who in England who identifies as British and someone who in Scotland would identify as British, and how there can actually be quite different people.
Yes, so that's right. I think that this debate is about identity, it's about economics, about governance, the constitutions. It mixes all these things up, but we haven't noticed that the identity debate about being British now gets lost in translation, because we're actually having different debates. You've got different newspapers and so on. And, we asked national identity in the census for the first time in 2011, and it turns out that the census isn't a very good way to get national identity. About a quarter of the people who answered the census in Britain ticked the British box. You were told tick as many as you want, but only a quarter of people did so. 7 out of 10 people in England, Scotland and Wales ticked England, Scotland and Wales box. In Northern Ireland it's a more complicated thing about the boxes you're ticking, but the Northern Irish box was appealing but British. But British was very much a minority thing in the census. I don't think that means that only 1 in 4 people feel British. There's quite a lot of evidence that 3/4 of people feel British. But the question that the room was asked there, which was more British than English, most of the room, 1 in 5 people in England, a bit more likely in London, 1 in 5 people in England feel more British than English. About a third say equally both. About a third say more English than British. So this is quite a rare thing. If you feel more British than English in England, you probably live in London. You're quite likely to be Hindu or Sikh. And if you're not, you're probably a Liberal Democrat and a Remainer. Those are the different groups of people who are in different ways. But you are either a left-leaning graduate or an ethnic, faith minority person. That is the group that feels more British. So the person who feels more British than Scottish in Scotland is likely to be older and whiter and more likely to be religiously observant, whereas the Christian or Protestant and so on. And obviously in Northern Ireland it plays out a different way. So when you say I'm feeling increasingly British in Birmingham and in Belfast, you're actually talking about something completely different now, because these are pairs. It's Britishness against the perceived, what are people saying with the St George's flag if there's not a football stadium, versus it's Scottishness versus the perceived new civic Scottish inclusive nationalism if you're in the modern SNP, or the pre-1974 SNP has got a different view. So it's quite lost in translation, I think, as to what we're talking about. So this is the problem for, say, unionism, that we've got much more consciously multinational political system. So we're probably never again going to have a British general election. We're not having a British general election now. We're having a series of general elections around the United Kingdom. When we count up the votes, if it's an absolute tie, we'll all have to stay up all night and find out what happened in Northern Ireland. Otherwise, we'll ignore them entirely, as we prefer to do. So you have 4 or 5 or 6 general elections in the cities and the university towns out on the coast in England, Scotland, Wales. You tot up the results, and you don't have the same policies on schools and health services. You don't read the same newspapers. So there are about 13 of these debates and yet people were paying no attention to the May debate in other places. So it's an aggregate multinational state, and we haven't really worked out what that means.
Kevin, talking of identity and shifting identities, and it leads nicely onto a question about Northern Ireland. We asked the tough questions here at Tortoise. So I wanted to get your view on, does Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, which despite some confusion between himself and Dominic Raab, seems to contain some sort of east-west checks between Northern Ireland and GB, does that make a border poll and a reunification of Ireland inevitable, and if not inevitable, far more likely?
Well, I've written a book saying it's inevitable, so I can't really resile from that one. Yes, I think it does. I think what we've seen is kind of, I suppose, over the last 3 years anyway. Brexit, I think, represents in the Northern Ireland debate an accelerant. I think it's poured over the dry tinder of lots of demographic and constitutional and political issues that are there anyway. So yes, I think it makes a border poll inevitable. I think that we can price that one in coming down the line. There was a Lord Ashcroft poll from a couple of months ago that showed on a straight choice, when you boil it down, take the don't knows out of the equation, 51 to 49. This is just Northern Ireland voters, 51 to 49 in favour of Irish unity. That's quite totemic that actually it's tilting. We're going to see Northern Ireland's centenary in 2021, 2022, depending on exactly whether you measure it legally or through partition. We're going to see probably in the 2021 census a majority of Catholics vis-a-vis Protestant people from Protestant faith in Northern Ireland. So there's lots of kinds of things happening anyway. And I think what Brexit represents, as I say, is an accelerant, and then we've kind of thrown a match on it, and then kind of off it goes. Yes, I mean we've seen. I mean, I think Boris has assumed, various positions, to put it politely, over the last couple of years in terms of Northern Ireland and the Union. He's there standing next to Arlene Foster at the DUP conference. And then of course we end up with a deal which as they say in Belfast, the dogs in the street could see where this was going to end, where this was going to land, and of course where we may be in a few weeks' time if he does win a majority is kind of railroading this through. Although as somebody pointed out before, every party in Northern Ireland is opposed to it. So we're in again, a space where we're dealing with lots of real ambiguities. But I think the difference with Northern Ireland is that there is a clear pathway that leads us to a border poll. It's not just a kind of, an ask. It's actually enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, and this is why republicanism particularly is bought into the Good Friday Agreement. It allows and facilitates the peaceful reunification of Ireland through exclusively democratic means. Perhaps British politics hasn't paid enough attention to that over the last 20 years. And I think what is happening now is that we can start to see through all the polling evidence, and I would put it as bluntly as that, but also the votes in real elections as well, and we may see this again just in a few weeks' time, that the tilt is starting to take place. Then you pile Brexit on the equation as well, and it tilts even more. And we may end up with the circumstances that demand a border poll is held. The Good Friday Agreement is slightly opaque. It's in the judgment of the Northern Ireland Secretary if various sort of conditions have been met. But I think that the balance of opinion is now that actually we are going to get to this point. There's a leading academic who made an intervention a few days ago, actually sort of starting to talk about dates when a border poll will be held. He was pitching 2023, 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. So opinion is I think shifting, but it is opinion that is based on evidence. So I think Northern Ireland is kind of, as I write, in an antechamber between its membership of the UK and its membership of a single new unitary Irish state. It's in that antechamber, and arguably it's been part there for a very long time. We're not so sanguine about sovereignty in any other context. We're quite happy to say if Northern Ireland wants to go, it can go. That's been a feature of British government policy effectively since the 1970s, articulated by Peter Brook, most famously with Britain having no selfish strategic or economic interests. So kind of Northern Ireland, I think, priced that one in. And for me, the interesting one is, and I don't have a dog in the fight, I'm not Scottish at all, but I can just look and see that actually Scotland is also drifting to that point where whether we embark on a conversation about a written constitution or whatever, we may just be too late with all this, quite frankly. We may be well too late about it. There's a very interesting debate going on about Yorkshire devolution and effectively a kind of economic UDI for Yorkshire that's going on at the moment. And as Sunder pointed out, this isn't one general election anymore. This is multiple elections with multiple factors. And I think one of the interesting aspects for me is the kind of English localism. You know, I didn't put my hand up for British or English really, because you know I would sort of say is there a category for chippy northerner, because that's effective for me. I want maximum devolution. I've had enough of the kind of north-south divide. It didn't get much better under Labour. It doesn't get any better under the Tories. Just give us the powers and just let us get on with it. So I think there's lots of identities that are now in play. I think on the issue of nationalism, I mean, if you look at all the nationalist parties in British politics, SNP, Plaid, SDLP, I would argue, and certainly Sinn Féin, they are all effectively parties of the left. So nationalism can be spliced with social democracy or something else to provide something that isn't as kind of, you know, as kind of malign as the nationalisms that are perhaps more common on the continent. And I think that's something else that, you know, when I hear Labour politicians having a go at the SNP and the Nats and all the rest of it, you know, Nicola Sturgeon is saying part of her price for backing Jeremy Corbyn is to spend an extra £35 billion on the English NHS to come up to Scottish standards. So I think Westminster is tone deaf. I think Westminster has been too late to the party. It has not understood the changes that are taking place, and it has not managed them. And my argument, I suspect, boils down to it's probably too late. Too late to stop Northern Ireland, and I don't think anybody in Britain, frankly, wants to. All the opinion poll evidence, again, suggests the British population is quite happy to see Northern Ireland go, and I think Scotland's gone too. And I think the warning signs were there. We haven't heeded them, and as a result, events have now proceeded too far.
I was struck watching Newsnight on Tuesday night, and they went to Northern Ireland, and the uniformity of the positions of the main Northern Ireland parties they had represented with Emily Maitlis. And they all, from the DUP on the right to Sinn Féin on the left, were in total agreement about how terrible Boris Johnson's deal was. And I was thinking, if you're an alien coming down from space and you're watching Newsnight for the first time, if you were, you've been missing out. And you see all these parties agreeing with each other, you think the problem with Northern Ireland is the parties all agree about everything, and there's not enough difference between the parties and who to vote for because of that. I was struck right at the start when we talked about the huge majority we have in the room, at least, for people who want to protect the union of the United Kingdom over their preferred Brexit end state. But it doesn't always seem that way in the general public. We were talking earlier about how Northern Ireland can sometimes feel like foreign policy on the mainland. So just wanted to ask the room, just what would it feel like to you either to have Northern Ireland have a border poll and then it votes for reunification, or it votes to stay? What is it to you if you live in London or you live in GB? What does it matter to you? It's Circa.
Yeah, I'm Patrick.
Patrick. Hi, Patrick.
Born in London, but I'm Irish and now living back in London. And I think like the idea of Irish unity is a romantic idea. I think economically, I don't think it's a great idea for the Republic to merge with the North. And then on the ideas of identity, I mean, identify as a Londoner, identify as Irish, identify as a European. And I think we're all getting a bit nervous about our identity because everything's becoming a bit more integrated in this digital age and things like that. And then you can, I don't think we can stop this devolution. I think all governments are going to devolve eventually, as you discussed there with like Yorkshire independence, Cornwall independence, Scottish independence. But I think what will be kept sacrosanct is probably the brand GB, because I think that's a real important thing. And I think you can have the devolution of government, but you can probably still keep that brand. I mean, it's a good brand. Philip aside, it's a good brand. And yeah, I mean, I just think we're going through a little bit of a blip at the moment with regards to a lot of different places looking for their own identity. I think overall the way the world is going is we are just getting more and more integrated. And I'm not sure you can fight that for too long.
Matt.
Yes, hello, my name's Nathan, I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise ThinkIn. So I, obviously, I mean, in response to your point, Jack, I mean, I guess my feeling, if any of the constituent parts of the UK voted to leave it, I would feel very sad, but that is their inalienable right. And if there was a referendum in Northern Ireland or a second referendum in Scotland and they vote to leave, then that would be, to me, very sad, but not something one could scarcely resist it. That would be intolerable. Why do I think it's sad? Well, I think it's sad because I think, although I understand why the UK carries imperialist overtones, I think I'm half Maltese, my children are half German. I like Britishness because it's a pluralist concept, and the idea of a loose federation of nations that has an identity, all of its own, distinct from the identities of its constituent parts, is very attractive to me. But I also have to be frank and say that I feel more of a Londoner than I feel an English person, which leads me to an interesting reflection upon myself as much as anything, which is that, and it's been reinforced, Tortoise has been on the road in the last 3 weeks in various towns in parts of the UK doing think-ins around the election. And one of the absolutely clear and perhaps not terribly surprising themes that's come out of these meetings has been the total sense of distinction between London and the rest. And the sense that the narrative that's coming out of London, Whitehall, Westminster and the main parties, and the narrative that people, which is narratives, one should say, that are happening in other parts of the nation, are completely parallel. And there's actually a worrying, someone when I was chairing in South Cambridgeshire this week, said there was no connective tissue any longer between the centre and the other parts, which I think is a very scary thing to think about. But I also worry that, to me, the whole Brexit debate is really a debate. I mean, Wales is part of it too, but its kind of fury is an argument between two kinds of Englishness. This reduces it to crude binary, so forgive me for that. But on the one hand, a kind of metropolitan, university-educated, London-based version of what it is to be a citizen of this country and have a kind of interdependence with the rest of the world, one of whose manifestations is a membership of the EU. And then in the rest of England, an anger at London's arrogance and an argument that that arrogance is partly expressed in the assumption that everyone wants to be a part of the EU and that the consequences of EU membership are all benign, and that parts of England have suffered mightily as a consequence of London's indifference and so on, and arguments we're all familiar with. And I think that one has to address that, but I think that one of the tragedies of Brexit is that the UK may break up because of English people's inability to sort this out. And that seems to me to be a very undesirable outcome amongst many that we may be about to see.
Jack, can I come in on that?
Sure.
I think it's helpful, actually, Matthew, if you frame it as an argument between versions of Englishness, because in a way, if you did that, that would also be a step forward. I think there's too much emphasis on Brexit as English nationalism. It's true that strong English identity drives some of it, but when 52% of people in Wales vote to leave, and you say there must be too many English people here to do that, it's really, it's a real simplification of, why a lot of people in Wales, or 40% of people in Scotland vote to leave. But if you make it an argument between Englishnesses, and then you say, let's turn up and have that argument, it'll be a step forward, because actually the London Liberal Remain anxiety and disdain actually for recognising England at all is a real part of what drives that that distinction, and it's missing a point. And a lot of work was done on British identity in my lifetime. The question, can you be black and British? Very central debate of the Enoch Powell era going forward doesn't get asked anymore. And yet people who've seen that change happen think we did it for Britishness and our institutions did it, but we probably haven't done it for Englishness yet. And people haven't turned up and debated English identity in the way that, you know, all sides in Scotland did make sure that Scotland was civic, but actually 95% of the ethnic diversity in the Britain that did that was in England. And that happened in England among the English and the British. And my parents from India and Ireland, they thought they could be British if they wanted. My dad did want to. My mum was Irish, didn't become British either. They wouldn't have thought you could be English as well, because migrants aren't often given a British passport. But the English-born children of British Commonwealth migrants worked out they could be English too. But there were no symbols for that other than the sports teams. And so the sports teams have pluralised Englishness. In Gareth Southgate's England, well, you know, London was very up for it, and so was Yorkshire, and that divide didn't exist that summer. And the rest of the time you're saying we've got nothing in common. But if you say we will only be able to do this with lovely civic Britishness that can be European, and everyone's got an English identity, they must be part of the problem. You're refusing actually to pluralise Englishness as well. And it's actually happened in public attitudes. I mean, we produced this, and John Dennis working on this. 90% of people now think you don't have to be white to be English. But I don't think the people who would really like that to be true. The Liberals believe that other people in England think that, but it's obvious because there's Maureen Ali, there's William Sterling. We've done it inside sporting stadiums, but we haven't got the language of doing that, and that would be a real bridge to build, that you'd have a plural Englishness and a civic Englishness as well as a civic Britishness.
Jim, with all this talk about identity makes me think about Scotland and independence and Brexit, and how is it the case that Brexit makes the emotional case for an independent Scotland stronger, but it actually makes the economic and practical case weaker?
In a word, yes. And it makes the emotional case stronger for reasons not unlike the ones we've just been discussing. It sharpens up identity. It makes the practical case harder because, of course, if Britain is outside the EU, and if the UK is outside the EU, we have the Irish border problem between Scotland and England without the Irish backstop. And that's a real, real problem. But I wonder if just to unpack that, I think this is a really interesting discussion about identity and Julian's point about patriotism and nationalism. I think maybe a better way of putting it is national sovereignty, to use a nice English legal phrase, is a concept that really needs to be retired. Right? In the world in which we now live, sovereignty is multiple and shared. Look at, in a globalized world, the idea that you can be autarkic, do it, making all your own decisions, is plainly crazy. When you look at the issues that we're all struggling with, you think about global warming, you think about trade, you think about the problems of globalization and managing the economic change that's happening across the world as a whole. You need shared sovereignties of various kinds to deal with that. Now, no one is suggesting, I certainly am not, that the shared sovereignty mechanisms of the EU are the best they could be. Having spent some time in Brussels trying to make them work, I can tell you that they are not. And nobody is saying either that the shared sovereignty mechanisms of the UK are perfect either. Part of our problem is that we haven't understood the ways to share sovereignty better. But the mirror image of that problem is that people are clinging to the idea of national sovereignty, of nationalism, which is not the same as patriotism. Patriotism is belonging and feeling of identity and liking the place and thinking the other folk are like you, and that's all just fine. Nationalism is the assertion that every culture must be a polity, that every imagined community must be a sovereign state. And those are two quite different kinds of proposition. And this is where, in my take on this, I've got a slightly different take from Kevin. I think the Irish question and the Scottish question are quite different for obvious reasons. The Irish question is not about Irish independence. Ireland's already independent. The Irish question is about Irish unification or not. The Scottish question is about the potential of independence or not. And there's those are different kinds of questions, because Northern Ireland, on any view, shares some sovereignty with somebody, whether it's Dublin or London. And our challenge, I think, is to find ways of saying to people, we recognise your desire for identity, whether it's English or British or multiple. And I think your point about identities being multiple for all of us is absolutely true. And we recognise that, and there are political institutions and ways which express that. You can call it devolution, you can call it federalism, you can call it confederalism, whatever the bundle of powers and responsibilities is. But what we've allowed to happen is that, particularly in response to the combination of some decades of globalisation and 1 decade of post-financial crisis economic trouble, people have clung to the notion of sovereignty, and that ghastly phrase, taking back control, which says, if only we were in charge of this, all this trouble would go away. And that's a category mistake, right? It's giving a political or a constitutional answer to what is in essence an economic question.
I'm going to come back to the room. Does anyone have a comment on either what Jim just said or anything else? Yes, sir.
Hi.
Can I get your name?
Sorry, my name is Mick.
Mick, hi.
Just extremely interesting, the gentleman here, about Brexit effectively being about 2 forms of English identity, the metropolitan versus outside the city. But does one draw from that then that the accelerated breakup of the Union, and particularly the idea of Scotland and the wishes there, are merely collateral damage to that internal conflict within England? Is that the...
What do you think?
Well, that's what it sounds like. I'd be curious what the panel would think.
Yes, sir.
I'm Jack. I mean, my great concern at the moment is that I think we're stumbling towards a major crisis in the next parliament that the parties aren't really thinking about at this election. I mean, partly in terms of Northern Ireland, I think there's very little comprehension of the fact that the threshold for a border poll will debatably be met very soon, and that could potentially be tested in the courts and present challenges for the government. But especially in the Scottish context, I think that this question of the Section 30 order, Boris Johnson's statement that he will never grant one in any circumstances, even if the SNP wins a majority in 2021, is extremely dangerous. And I think Sunder, I think it was, who said that we're not Spain and Catalonia, I think is right, but also I think that there's a potential that a Catalan-style crisis is something that we're stumbling towards if our politicians don't give it more attention, even in spite of obviously the Brexit issues that are understandably right at the top of their agenda at the moment.
Thank you. Anyone else on the floor want to add to that? Yes, James.
James, I work here. I think it's kind of important to remember the history of violence in Northern Ireland, and that as the threshold for a border poll will probably be met at some point in the near future. And the lack of Westminster at the moment to govern effectively, and the lack of Stormont to really govern at all. We have to be very careful that debate leading up to the border poll, and debate within actually during the referendum is not hijacked by kind of extreme populism and violent rhetoric, because that will slide into actual, very real violence. And I don't think that the government here is at all prepared for that.
We are nearing the end, but there's still time to ask Jess and to get the IFG view. So how can government, you've heard what James and others have said, how can government be sufficiently reactive and change in order to manage, whether it's manage all these different identities or actually manage a border poll? What can government do to manage all these problems that are coming up that aren't even Brexit?
I mean, that's a very big question. But I think it comes back to some of what I was saying earlier in terms of these different constitutional understandings and also the different identities, and that I think the UK government needs to be a bit more sensitive towards those and kind of think about that when it's making policy, when it's making decisions, So coming back to what Jack was saying about a kind of Section 30 order, essentially this question is two separate questions. There's a question of whether there should be a second referendum on Scottish independence and who should have the power to hold one. Now, the UK government's reaction is to essentially conflate those two questions and just say no, no, no. But fundamentally, that leads them potentially into a trap where then it allows the Scottish government to say that the UK government is denying the Scottish people the right to self-determination. In a way, they're not thinking carefully about those particular sensitivities and different understandings. They're just kind of taking a hard line. And I think the UK government needs to be better about thinking about all these different things and making sure that it thinks about them.
Great. Well, I've just seen out of the corner of my eye that Agatha has run her race, and once again she has beaten us. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour or so. I just wanted to make a few conclusions and pick up on a few points as is sort of supposed to happen in a leader meeting in a newspaper. Patrick, I thought your point about we're getting nervous about our identities because there's so much integration and we're holding on to certain things because of that. I think that was really interesting. Sunder, I'm still struck by, because I'd never thought about it before, your case about being British in England versus being British in Scotland. You are two pretty different kinds of people, and that just speaks to how different Englishness and Scottishness are. Jess, as a former civil servant myself, thinking about how, and actually worked in devolved spending, but looking at I've lots of anecdotes about Barnet Foreman if you want to stay after for more fun. But how the asymmetry that's inherent in the different populations in the UK and how they can work together so that England doesn't just trample on, when I say England I mean the Treasury, trample on the devolved nations. So there's much more buy-in, I think would be extremely helpful as a start. John, the case for a written constitution, I don't know whether you've come to any of our think-ins on that, but it won't be the last time we discuss it, so please do come again, because it's extraordinary how fundamental that point is to so much that we talk about, particularly, you think of the last year in British politics. Gillian, trying to reclaim the term nationalism. I think the SNP certainly try and do that by adding the word civic in front of it, but it is interesting how it does appear to be, in the same way that people are trying to reclaim Englishness as not being something that's part of the British National Party, trying to reclaim nationalism as well. And we'll see what happens on that front. All that's left for me to say is to thank our excellent speakers, Kevin, Sunder, Jim and Jess, and to thank you all very much for coming. Cheers.